Today we're exploring one of the most astonishing chapters of aerial warfare during World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress earned its legendary reputation not just for the bombs it dropped or the battles it won, but for the men who flew in it and the impossible situations they somehow survived. We're talking about crewmen who fell thousands of feet without parachutes and lived to tell the tale. We're talking about aircraft that flew home in pieces, held together by little more than hope and thin strips of aluminum. These aren't Hollywood inventions or exaggerated war stories. These are documented, verified accounts of survival against odds so astronomical they defy belief. Before we dive into these individual stories of survival, we need to understand the broader context of what these men faced every single time they climbed into their aircraft. The strategic bombing campaign over Nazi-occupied Europe wasn't just dangerous. It was, statistically speaking, one of the deadliest jobs in the entire war. When you signed up to be a bomber crewman, you were essentially volunteering for a position with a 71% casualty rate. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly 3 out of every 4 men who served in heavy bomber crews were either killed, severely wounded, or went missing in action. That's approximately 100,000 service members. The phrase, "you probably won't make it home," wasn't pessimism. It was cold, hard mathematics. During the early days of the bombing campaign in 1942 and 1943, completing the required 25 mission tour was considered statistically impossible. The numbers simply didn't add up in your favor. In a single raid on August 17, 1943, 60 B-17s were shot down out of a formation of 376 aircraft. That's a 16% loss rate in a single day. 16%. And that was just one mission. Some men flew dozens of these raids. The famous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. Of the 291 bombers that set out for the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, 60 never came home. Another 138 returned so badly damaged they needed extensive repairs before they could fly again. Only 93 aircraft returned without battle damage. Let me say that again. Only 93 out of 291 came through unscathed. The United States built 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses during the war. Of those, 4,735 were destroyed either in combat or accidents. That's a loss rate exceeding 37% of all B-17s ever built. Every month during the height of the war, the 8th Air Force was losing between 1,000 and 1,500 aircraft over Europe. That works out to somewhere between 33 and 50 aircraft destroyed every single day. Behind each of those numbers was a crew of 10 men whose families back home would receive a telegram beginning with the words, "We regret to inform you." The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress Engineering. Marvel understanding. Why these survival stories matter requires understanding what the B-17 actually was. The aircraft earned its Flying Fortress nickname for good reason. By the final G model, these bombers bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns positioned at strategic points throughout the aircraft. Picture a porcupine made of aluminum and bristling with defensive firepower. The nose contained twin guns in a chin turret. The dorsal position featured another turret with twin 50s. On either side of the fuselage, waist gunners stood at open windows with their weapons. Underneath, suspended in a small plexiglass sphere, the ball turret gunner operated 2 more machine guns. At the very rear, the tail gunner commanded his isolated position with twin 50s of his own. The aircraft could deliver these guns overlapping fields of fire in nearly every direction. The B-17's 4 Wright Cyclone engines could push the fully loaded bomber to altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, though crews often operated between 28 and 30,000 feet on deep penetration missions. At these heights, the temperature outside plummeted to 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The aircraft wasn't pressurized. Whatever temperature existed outside was the temperature the crew experienced inside. Men wore electrically heated flight suits and heavy leather boots lined with fur, but frostbite remained a constant companion on long missions. Your breath would freeze on your oxygen mask. Your machine guns could freeze if you didn't keep them cycling. The cold was so intense, it could kill you almost as quickly as enemy fire. The B-17 could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs on shorter missions, though the standard combat load for deeper penetrations into Germany typically ranged around 4,000 pounds. The aircraft's combat range extended to approximately 2,000 miles, giving it the reach to strike deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. But here's the crucial detail that made everything else possible. The B-17 was tough. Incredibly, almost impossibly tough. These aircraft absorbed punishment that by all rights should have torn them apart. Bombers limped home with entire sections blown away. They flew with engines on fire, with massive holes torn through their fuselages, with tail sections hanging by threads of aluminum. The B-17's reputation for bringing crews home when any other aircraft would have failed became legendary. The stories we're about to explore prove why. The American daylight bombing strategy. American military doctrine during World War II differed fundamentally from the British approach to strategic bombing. The Royal Air Force flew their raids at night, using darkness as cover against German defenses. American commanders, however, believed their B-17 flying in tight formations could fight their way through German airspace in broad daylight and hit targets with precision accuracy. The theory was simple. Mass defensive firepower from hundreds of bombers flying in coordinated formations would create such devastating crossfire that German fighters would be unable to press home effective attacks. Meanwhile, the famed Norden bomb sight would allow bombardiers to drop their ordnance with pinpoint accuracy, hitting specific factories, rail yards, and military installations. The reality proved more complicated and far bloodier than anticipated. Yes, the tight formations did provide mutual defensive fire. Yes, the bombers could and did fight their way to their targets, but German defenses evolved rapidly. The Luftwaffe developed head-on attack tactics, roaring straight at bomber formations where defensive fire was weakest. They mounted cannons and rockets on their fighters specifically designed to break up bomber formations from beyond the range of defensive machine gun fire. German ground forces ringed every valuable target with batteries of 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft guns arranged in coordinated networks of dozens or even hundreds of weapons. These weren't crews randomly firing into the sky hoping to get lucky. German flak batteries employed radar and sophisticated fire control systems that calculated exactly where the bombers would be. As formations approached their targets, the sky ahead would suddenly erupt with black puffs of exploding shells, each burst sending thousands of red-hot steel fragments slicing through the air. The protocol for bomb runs demanded that aircraft maintain tight formation and fly straight and level during the final approach. No evasive maneuvers, no deviating from the planned course. The bombardier needed a stable platform to properly employ his Norden sight and achieve the precision accuracy that justified the entire strategic bombing campaign. So crews had to sit there, flying straight through fields of exploding shells, watching nearby bombers get hit, watching them start smoking, watching them fall away from the formation. You'd hope to see parachutes blooming below the stricken aircraft. More often, you wouldn't see any. Fighter attacks remained the primary danger early in the war, which explains all those defensive gun positions. But the introduction of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter eventually provided bombers much-needed protection against the Luftwaffe. The sleek, maneuverable Mustangs could accompany the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, engaging German interceptors before they could savage the bomber formations. Flak, however, remained unavoidable and impossible to fight back against. You couldn't shoot at an 88mm gun from 25,000 feet. You could only fly through it and hope the steel fragments that tore through your aircraft missed anything vital, including you. The ball turret, sphere of vulnerability. Among all the positions on a B-17, the ball turret occupies a unique place in the nightmares of those who served. Imagine a plexiglass and aluminum sphere, barely 4 feet in diameter, suspended beneath the aircraft's belly. Now, imagine cramming yourself inside this sphere in a fetal position, your knees pulled up near your chest, your back pressed against the curved rear wall, your face inches from twin 50-caliber machine guns that extend through the entire turret to either side of your head. You're wearing an electrically heated flight suit over multiple layers of clothing, bulky boots, a leather helmet, an oxygen mask frozen to your face, and all of it stuffed into a space that wouldn't comfortably fit a large dog. To enter the ball turret, the gunner would first rotate it until the guns pointed straight down. Then, he'd open the hatch in the floor of the aircraft and lower himself feet first into the turret, placing his boots in the heel rests. Once inside, he'd close and lock the hatch above him. Now, he was alone in his isolated sphere, dangling beneath 25 tons of aircraft flying at 200 miles per hour, 6 miles above enemy territory, in temperatures that could reach 50 below zero. The turret rotated 360 degrees horizontally and 90 degrees vertically, giving the gunner coverage of the entire underbelly of the aircraft. This made the ball turret crucial for defending against fighters attacking from below, one of the Luftwaffe's preferred attack angles. But the ball turret's defensive capabilities came at a terrible price in vulnerability and discomfort. The space was so cramped that most gunners couldn't wear their parachutes inside the turret. The parachute pack would be stowed just outside the turret door in the fuselage. Think about what this meant in an emergency. If the aircraft was shot down and the order came to bail out, the ball turret gunner would need to rotate his turret back to the entry position, open the hatch, climb up into the fuselage, locate his parachute, strap it on, and then make his way to an escape hatch. All of this while the aircraft might be on fire, breaking apart, spinning out of control, or all three simultaneously. The cold in the ball turret was particularly savage. The sphere was completely uninsulated. The electrically heated suit helped, but your hands and feet would go numb regardless. Your face, pressed against freezing metal and plexiglass, took the worst of it. The oxygen mask would frost over, ice would form on your eyebrows, the gun sight hanging between your legs would fog up, making it harder to track targets. You'd operate your controls with hands so cold you could barely feel the triggers. 2 joysticks controlled the turret's rotation and elevation while also housing the firing mechanisms for the machine guns. One foot operated a pedal that controlled the gun sight. The other foot's pedal ran your intercom connection to the rest of the crew, your only lifeline to the world outside your isolated sphere. Statistics on ball turret casualty rates vary depending on the source. Some studies suggest the ball turret had the lowest fatality rate among B-17 crew positions, protected as it was by the aircraft's bulk above and surrounded by armor plating. Other analyses indicate ball turret gunners suffered double the mortality rate of other crew positions, being exposed under the aircraft and often unable to escape if the bomber went down. What's not debatable is the psychological weight of the position. Every ball turret gunner knew that if the landing gear failed and the aircraft had to belly land, the ball turret would likely be crushed on impact. There would be no time to exit. You'd simply be ground into the tarmac along with your turret. This wasn't paranoia. It happened. Not often, but often enough that every ball turret gunner had heard the stories. Alan Magee, falling through glass. Staff Sergeant Alan Magee stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 155 pounds, making him ideally sized for the cramped confines of the ball turret. Born in Plainfield, New Jersey, as the youngest of 6 children, Magee joined the Army Air Forces immediately after Pearl Harbor. He applied to become a pilot, but was assigned instead to the ball turret gunner position on a B-17F, nicknamed Snap Crackle Pop after the Rice Krispies cereal mascots. The bomber's pilot, Captain Jacob Fredericks, had worked as an engineer for the Kellogg Company before the war and had convinced a Kellogg's artist to paint the cereal mascots on the aircraft's nose. On January 3, 1943, Magee's bomber joined 84 other B-17s from the 303rd Bomb Group for a daylight raid on the German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. The port city, nicknamed Flak City by bomber crews, housed a critical U-boat base and dry dock facilities. This would be Magee's 7th combat mission. He was 24 years old. The formation approached the target around noon. As they neared Saint-Nazaire, German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, the sky filled with the black puffs of 88mm shells detonating all around them. Magee crouched in his ball turret, scanning the sky below for enemy fighters, knowing that at any moment a burst of flak could tear through his plexiglass sphere. The first hit damaged Magee's ball turret, rendering it inoperable. He rotated it to the exit position and climbed up into the aircraft's fuselage, intending to man one of the waist gun positions instead. That's when he discovered his parachute had been shredded by flak fragments. Multiple holes perforated the silk canopy. The parachute was useless. Before Magee could fully process this information, a second flak burst struck the aircraft's right wing, tearing away a section of it. The B-17 immediately entered a violent spin. The centrifugal forces were crushing. Magee's vision began to tunnel as hypoxia set in. At 22,000 feet without supplemental oxygen, you have maybe 4 minutes of useful consciousness. Less if you're being thrown around the interior of a violently spinning aircraft. The aircraft continued to disintegrate around him. Another explosion tore through the bomber, and the force of it simply ejected Magee out of the aircraft like a stone from a slingshot. He tumbled through the freezing air at over 4 miles altitude, falling at approximately 120 miles per hour. He lost consciousness almost immediately, either from the lack of oxygen, the extreme cold, or the sheer trauma of the situation. Probably all three. Alan Magee fell for over 2 minutes. 2 minutes of tumbling through space at terminal velocity, 2 minutes closer to certain death with every passing second. But fate, physics, and an extraordinary piece of architecture conspired to save his life. The Saint-Nazaire railway station featured a large glass roof composed of angled panels. As Magee's unconscious body plummeted toward the earth, he crashed through this glass roof. The angled glass panels shattered on impact, but they also slowed his descent. The friction, the breaking glass, the angle of the panels, all of it bled away just enough velocity that when Magee finally hit the stone floor of the station, the impact was survivable. Barely. German soldiers found him moments later, alive but catastrophically injured. His right arm was nearly severed, hanging by threads of muscle and tendon. His right leg and ankle were broken. He had suffered 28 separate shrapnel and glass wounds. His face was severely injured, his nose broken, one eye damaged. He had internal injuries, including a punctured lung and numerous broken ribs. His teeth were shattered. The German soldiers were so stunned to find him alive that they immediately summoned medical help. A German military doctor examined Magee and then made a decision that saved his arm and probably his life. The doctor told Magee, "We are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm." True to his word, the doctor spent hours painstakingly reconstructing Magee's nearly severed arm. Magee never learned the doctor's name, but he carried gratitude for that unnamed German surgeon for the rest of his life. After treatment, Magee spent the next 18 months as a prisoner of war at Stalag Luft 17B in Braunau, Austria. Despite everything, he survived. He made a full recovery. He was liberated in May of 1945. After the war, Magee earned his pilot's license and worked in the airline industry. In 1993 or 95, the dates vary in different accounts, Magee returned to Saint-Nazaire with his wife Helen for a memorial ceremony honoring the 75 Allied airmen killed in the January 3rd raid, including his 7 crewmates who went down with Snap Crackle Pop. The bomber had crashed in flames in a forest near the city. Magee stood before a memorial plaque bearing the names of his crew. He saw the restored nose art panel from his bomber, which German forces had cut away as a trophy and displayed in their headquarters until the city's liberation. A French citizen had rescued it from a ravine where the retreating Germans had thrown it. Alan Magee died in San Angelo, Texas on December 20, 2003, at the age of 84. He had lived 60 years beyond the day he fell more than 4 miles without a parachute and survived. Eugene Moran, riding the tail-down Staff Sergeant Eugene Paul Moran, grew up on a farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. Born on July 17, 1924, he was just 19 years old when he enlisted in the Army Air Forces following Pearl Harbor. Farm work had given him a lean, wiry build. More importantly, it had taught him that survival often meant staying calm when everything around you was falling apart. This lesson would serve him extraordinarily well. Moran trained as a tail gunner and was assigned to the 996 Bomb Group. His aircraft, a B-17F, bore the peculiar name Rikki Tikki Tavi, taken from Rudyard Kipling's story about a brave mongoose. On November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-17s took off for a bombing mission against the heavily defended industrial city of Bremen, Germany. Moran and his crew had only completed 4 previous missions. They were still learning their trade, still figuring out how to survive in the most dangerous airspace in the world. The formation approached Bremen shortly after midday. Over the intercom came the warning every crew dreaded. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." German Messerschmitt fighters armed with 21-centimeter rockets attacked head-on, the rockets streaking through the formation. The first bombers began to fall. Moran, isolated in his tail position at the very rear of the aircraft, prepared his twin 50-caliber machine guns. He could see the German fighters making their runs, could see other bombers in the formation taking hits. The bombers successfully dropped their payloads over Bremen and turned for home. But Rikki-Tikki-Tavi began to fall behind the protective formation. Maybe engine damage, maybe control problems. The exact cause doesn't matter. What matters is that a lone B-17, separated from the formation's mutual defensive fire, became a target of opportunity. German fighters swarmed the struggling bomber. Moran fired back, his machine guns hammering away at the attacking Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. But there were too many of them. Incoming fire raked the B-17 from nose to tail. Moran took hits in both arms. Another burst of cannon fire broke several of his ribs. He looked down and discovered his parachute had been shot to ribbons by German fighters. If he needed to bail out, he'd be jumping without a parachute. Then came the catastrophic hit. Cannon fire severed the B-17's tail section completely. The entire tail, from just forward of the vertical stabilizer, separated from the fuselage. Inside that detached tail section, Eugene Moran suddenly found himself falling through the sky in what amounted to a small, bullet-riddled aluminum capsule. The tail section tumbled and spun as it fell. Moran, already wounded and unable to see out of his position, didn't immediately realize he'd been separated from the rest of the aircraft. He thought the entire bomber was going down. The G-forces from the tumbling tail pinned him in place. He couldn't move. Couldn't reach the manual bailout door even if he'd had a working parachute. All he could do was wait for the impact he knew was coming. Eugene Moran made a decision that probably saved his life. He stopped fighting. He accepted that he was going to die, and he forced himself to relax. Going limp, staying loose, might give him a fractionally better chance of surviving the impact. It was the only thing he could control, so he controlled it. The tail section fell for over 2 minutes from 28,000 feet. 2 minutes is a long time to contemplate your mortality. 2 minutes is a long time to fall toward your death. The tail struck the tops of tall pine trees in a forest near the town of Seik, south of Bremen. The flexible young pines bent and broke under the impact, slowing the tail section just enough. When it finally hit the ground, Moran was alive. Barely. German soldiers who witnessed the crash rushed to the wreckage, expecting to find a corpse. Instead, they found Eugene Moran conscious, in agony, but breathing. His skull was crushed. He had shrapnel wounds throughout his body. Both arms had been shot. His ribs were broken. German forces transported him to a prisoner of war camp where a Serbian doctor, himself a prisoner, performed emergency surgery. The doctor inserted a metal plate in Moran's skull to protect his exposed brain. With minimal medical supplies and under primitive conditions, the Serbian physician kept Moran alive. The doctor's name, like the German surgeon who saved Majee's arm, has been lost to history. Moran endured 17 to 18 months as a prisoner of war, moved from camp to camp across Germany, Poland, and Russia. Between February and April of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed around them, the Germans forced Moran and thousands of other prisoners on a 600-mile forced march across the frozen landscape. Moran, weakened by his injuries and poor treatment, weighed only 128 pounds when American forces finally liberated him at Bitterfeld, Germany, on April 26, 1945. Against all odds, he survived not just the impossible fall, but the brutal months of captivity that followed. Eugene Moran was awarded 2 Purple Hearts, the Air Medal with Gold Leaf Cluster, the Good Conduct Medal, and the European Theater Medal. He returned to Soldiers Grove, married, and had 9 children. In 2008, his hometown named a street after him. Staff Sergeant Eugene Paul Moran died on March 23, 2014, at the age of 90. He had lived 70 years beyond the day he rode a detached bomber tail 4 miles to Earth and walked away from the wreckage. Other miraculous falls. Alan McGee and Eugene Moran weren't the only Allied airmen to survive impossible falls during World War II. In January 1944, another B-17 tailgunner named James Leslie experienced an eerily similar fate to Moran's. During a mission near Athens, Leslie's bomber collided with another B-17 in thick cloud cover. The collision severed the tail section with Leslie still inside. Like Moran, he found himself falling inside a detached section of aircraft, not even realizing he'd been separated from the rest of the bomber until after the tail section crashed into trees, and he climbed out to discover the rest of the aircraft was simply gone. Greek Orthodox monks found him and provided assistance. Nicholas Alcemade provides perhaps the most purely miraculous fall of any World War II airman. Alcemade served as a tail gunner with No. 115 Squadron, Royal Air Force, flying Avro Lancaster bombers. On the night of March 24, 1944, Alcemade's Lancaster participated in an 811 aircraft raid on Berlin. During the return flight over the heavily defended Ruhr Valley, a German Junkers Ju-88 night fighter piloted by Oberleutnant Heinz Rücker intercepted the Lancaster and attacked from below with cannon and machine gun fire. The starboard wing and fuselage erupted in flames. The perspex glazing of Alcemade's tail turret was completely blown away, exposing him to the frigid night air rushing past at over 200 miles per hour. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out. Alcemade centered his turret and opened the doors to access the fuselage where his parachute was stowed. He found himself staring into an inferno. His parachute was already consumed by flames. The hydraulic fluid in his turret caught fire, spraying him with liquid flames that set his clothing alight. Alcemade faced a choice between burning to death in the flaming bomber or jumping from 18,000 feet without a parachute. He chose to jump, preferring a quick death on impact to the agony of burning alive. Nicholas Alcemade stepped out of his burning aircraft and fell 3.5 miles at over 120 miles per hour. He lost consciousness during the fall. 3 hours later, he woke up on the ground in a snow-covered pine forest. The flexible pine trees had slowed his descent. Deep snow cushioned his final impact. He had survived with only a sprained knee, some burns, and cuts from broken perspex. No broken bones, no life-threatening injuries. German soldiers who captured him refused to believe his story. They were convinced he was a spy who had buried his parachute. They held him in solitary confinement while the Gestapo interrogated him. Only when investigators found the burned remains of Alcemade's parachute still in the wreckage of his Lancaster did they accept his account. The Germans gave him a certificate officially confirming his survival. Alcemade spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luft III, the same camp featured in the film The Great Escape. He was liberated in May 1945. Alcemade worked in the chemical industry after the war and appeared on British television shows to tell his story. He died in 1987 at age 64. The All-American, flying in 2 pieces. On February 1, 1943, a formation of B-17s from the 97th Bomb Group departed their base near Biskra, Algeria, bound for the German-controlled seaports at Bizerte and Tunis, Tunisia. Among them was a B-17F 5BO, serial number 41-24406, nicknamed All-American. The bomber carried a crew of 10 men, including pilot 2nd Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg Jr. and co-pilot 2nd Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr. After successfully dropping their bombs on the harbor facilities, the formation turned for the 300-mile return journey to base. That's when 2 German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters attacked the formation in a head-on assault. The B-17 gunners responded with concentrated fire from their defensive positions. The first German fighter went down in flames, but the second Messerschmitt, flown by German ace Erich Paxia, who had 16 confirmed victories, pressed his attack against the All-American. Machine gun and cannon fire from the bomber apparently killed or severely wounded Paxia. His fighter, no longer under control, could not complete its roll away from the bomber. The BF-109's wing sliced through the rear fuselage of the All-American like a guillotine blade. The collision carved a diagonal gash from the base of the vertical stabilizer and completely severed the left horizontal stabilizer from the aircraft. The only thing keeping the tail section attached to the bomber was a strip of metal near the right tailplane and some twisted fragments of the floor structure. The tail gunner, Sergeant Sam Sarpolis, found himself trapped in what had become, effectively, a separate aircraft connected to the rest of the bomber by the thinnest of threads. Lieutenant Charles Cutforth, a navigator flying in another B-17, managed to snap what would become one of the most famous photographs of World War II, the All-American flying in formation with its tail section hanging at an impossible angle, daylight visible through the massive gash in the fuselage, yet somehow still airborne. Inside the All-American, Lieutenant Bragg and his co-pilot performed an assessment that defied belief. Both starboard engines were dead. The left oil pump had a severe leak. Nearly every control cable to the tail section had been severed. The radios were destroyed. The electrical system was badly damaged. The oxygen system was inoperative, meaning they couldn't remain at altitude without the crew suffocating. The hole in the fuselage measured over 4 feet wide at its widest point and 16 feet long. But by extraordinary fortune, the autopilot had been engaged during the collision. Unlike the mechanical cable systems, the autopilot used electrical wiring connected to electric motor servos mounted near the rudder and elevator. Those circuits remained intact. Bragg could still control the aircraft, barely using these remaining systems. The crew worked frantically to keep the bomber from tearing itself apart. Waist gunners and other crew members grabbed pieces of the shattered German fighter lodged in the fuselage and used their parachute harness cords to try to brace the tail section, wrapping the lines around structural members to keep the two sides of the fuselage from splitting further apart. The tail section bounced and swayed in the slipstream, twisting alarmingly whenever the aircraft turned. Sarpolis remained at his tail gun position. His weight, ironically, helped stabilize the tail section. Attempts to evacuate him to the forward part of the aircraft only caused more violent flexing that threatened to snap the final connections holding everything together. He had to stay where he was. Lieutenant Bragg kept the All-American flying for 90 minutes back to Biskra, maintaining formation with the rest of the group as much as possible so they could provide protective fire if German fighters attacked again. Several Me-109s did make approaches but were driven off by the formation's defensive fire and the miraculous fact that all Americans' guns were still operational, including those in the severed tail section. Bragg brought the bomber in for landing. Witnesses at the airfield watched in disbelief as the flying fortress touched down with its tail section hanging at a grotesque angle. On landing, the tail section finally collapsed, but all 10 crew members walked away without serious injuries. The All-American was later repaired by attaching a new tail section and returned to service, though the field repairs left it slower and less maneuverable than before. It flew utility and cargo missions until being scrapped in March 1945. The Lovely Julie, flying without a nose, October 15, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched hundreds of B-17s for another raid on Cologne, Germany. Among them was B-17G serial number 43-38172, nicknamed Lovely Julie, from the 601st Bomb Squadron of the 398th Bomb Group based at Nut Hampstead, England. First Lieutenant Lawrence Delancey commanded the bomber. It was co-pilot Second Lieutenant Philip Stallman's 25th and final mission. After this flight, he could go home. The formation reached Cologne and made their bomb run. Staff Sergeant George Abbott, serving as the toggler and bombardier, successfully released the payload. The bombers turned for home. That's when the flak batteries opened up. A German 88mm shell detonated directly in the nose compartment of Lovely Julie. The explosion killed George Abbott instantly. His body absorbed most of the shrapnel that would otherwise have torn through the cockpit and killed the pilots, but the blast obliterated the entire nose section of the aircraft. The plexiglass nose cone vanished. The aluminum skin and internal structure simply ceased to exist. The instrument panel was shredded. The airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, all destroyed. The oxygen system was severed. At 27,000 feet with a sub-zero gale blasting through the open front of the fuselage at 200 miles per hour, the cockpit became a nightmare of freezing wind and flying debris. Delancey and Stallman sat in what amounted to an open-air convertible 6 miles above Germany. Without oxygen, the crew would lose consciousness within minutes at that altitude. Delancey made the only decision that offered any chance of survival. He pushed the nose down and dove to a lower altitude where the crew could breathe without supplemental oxygen. This put them well within range of every German gun between Cologne and the English Channel, but staying at altitude meant certain death from hypoxia. The navigator, Lieutenant Raymond Ledoux, had lost all his maps and instruments in the explosion. Working with only a questionable magnetic compass mounted above the windshield, Ledoux had to navigate them home through enemy territory while freezing wind tore at his face. The crew, certain they were living their final moments, prepared for the inevitable crash. But Lawrence Delancey wasn't finished. With most of the nose gone, both pilots freezing in the -40-degree slipstream, no functioning instruments, and battle damage throughout the aircraft, Delancey kept lovely Julie flying. He nursed the dying bomber across Germany, over the Netherlands, and across the English Channel. They made it back to Nut Hampstead. The landing gear extended. No hydraulic pressure meant no brakes, but Delancey put the bomber down anyway, in what witnesses described as a beautiful landing despite impossible conditions. All crew members except George Abbott survived. Flight surgeon Dr. Robert Sweet met them as they landed and immediately distributed sedatives, ordering them to their quarters to sleep. No interviews, no photographs, just rest. Lawrence Delancey received the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism and flying skill. Philip Stallman completed his 25th mission after all and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. Bailout between death and captivity. For every survival story about aircraft returning home against impossible odds, countless more crews had to abandon their bombers over enemy territory. The bailout order meant you'd pulled your last lifeline. Everything that happened after you jumped was up to fate. And jumping from a B-17 under combat conditions wasn't like a practice jump from a transport aircraft. The bomber might be on fire. It might be in an uncontrolled spin. Parts of it might be exploding. You had to navigate narrow escape hatches while wearing bulky flight gear and possibly injured. Many crewmen were knocked unconscious or further injured during the exit itself. Some became tangled in the aircraft structure as they tried to bail out. Of all the B-17 crew members shot down during the war, only about 25% successfully bailed out and deployed their parachutes. 3/4 didn't make it out. If you did manage to escape the aircraft and your parachute opened, you'd drift down through hostile airspace, while German fighters sometimes made firing passes at helpless parachuting airmen. It happened. Not often, and many Luftwaffe pilots refused to engage such targets, but it happened. You'd hit the ground behind enemy lines, possibly injured, certainly disoriented. Then began the race. Could you evade capture long enough to make contact with resistance networks that might help you escape back to Allied lines? Could local civilians hide you despite the severe penalties Germans imposed on anyone caught helping downed airmen? Most couldn't. Most were captured within hours or days. Captivity as a prisoner of war meant 18 months or more in camps like Stalag Luft III or Stalag Luft 17B. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected captured airmen, and generally the Germans did treat downed airmen better than they treated other prisoners. Food was inadequate but usually sufficient to sustain life, supplemented by Red Cross parcels when available. But you'd spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire, never knowing if you'd survive to liberation, never knowing if the camp guards might simply execute everyone if Germany faced final defeat. And liberation itself could be deadly as the Third Reich collapsed. Thousands of prisoners were forced on brutal death marches through the winter of 1944 and 45, as camp populations were evacuated ahead of advancing Allied armies. Legacy and conclusion. The stories we've explored today represent just a handful of the thousands of extraordinary survival accounts from the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. Alan McGee falling through a train station roof, Eugene Moran riding a detached tail section to Earth, Nicholas Alcemade dropping into a snowy forest, the All-American flying home with its tail hanging by threads, lovely Julie landing without a nose. These stories endure because they remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the equally incredible toughness of the B-17 Flying Fortress. But we must remember these survival stories exist against a backdrop of staggering loss. For every Alan McGee who fell and survived, hundreds of others fell and didn't. For every All-American that made it home, dozens of other bombers disintegrated over Germany with their crews still aboard. The 8th Air Force suffered 26,000 killed in action, more than 40,000 total casualties. These weren't abstract numbers. These were 19 and 20-year-old kids from small towns across America who volunteered to fight fascism and paid with their lives. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the men who flew in it changed warfare forever. Strategic bombing, despite all its costs and controversies, helped bring World War II to an end by crippling Germany's ability to wage war. The precision bombing doctrine that sent these men into harm's way did eventually succeed in destroying German industry, though at a price that would be considered intolerable today. The lessons learned from the air war over Europe informed everything that came after, from the strategic bombing campaigns in Korea and Vietnam to the precision strikes of the modern era. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy. You can still occasionally see them at air shows, these magnificent bombers thundering overhead with their 4 radial engines roaring. And if you close your eyes and listen, you can almost imagine what it must have been like to fly in formation with hundreds of others just like it, all heading into the teeth of the deadliest air defenses the world had ever seen. We remember these aircraft, we preserve them, we study them. But most importantly, we remember the men who flew them. Men like Alan McGee, Eugene Moran, Lawrence Delancey, men who did impossible things in impossible situations, men who fell from the sky and somehow lived to tell about it. If you found these stories fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These accounts of World War II history help us understand the sacrifices made by the generation that fought fascism. By keeping their stories alive, we honor their service and ensure their courage isn't forgotten. There are countless more stories to tell about the air war over Europe, and I'll continue bringing them to you. Until next time, remember the men who flew into hell and somehow made it home.